We go to Southgate there in Columbia, Tennessee, and Byron Ferris was asking me where I had been this last Wednesday. And I said, I'd been up to Winchester. He said, hey, my dad and mom go to Winchester. And then my granddad, Kenneth Ferris, goes there. And he's related to Barry Ferris, who is Dr. Ferris, who teaches at Columbia Academy, who taught me when I was in I guess about the 7th and 8th grade. And so you just never know. They say that the church makes the world a small place. And lots of times it does, because there are connections that you have all over. Brother Kenneth was watching online via the internet. And so I was excited to know that not only do we have the people that are here with us, but we also have several people that are watching online, and we're glad to have them. In 2006, Cobb County, Georgia had a serious brouhaha in the school system, because the board in that particular school district decided that they wanted their kids to be aware of something that was going on in the textbooks. And so they put a sticker in their biology textbooks, the front of it, in their 9th grade biology textbooks. It said, "This book contains information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about how living organisms came to be. It should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered." Now, let's go over that again. This book contains information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about how living organisms came to be. It should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Now, several people in the skeptical community sued the Cobb County School District for putting that sticker in the biology textbooks. And what they said was it was too religious. And that's exactly what they contended, and they took that before the district court, and the judge said that that sticker was too religious and made them rip all of the stickers out of the 9th grade biology textbooks. I was there speaking not long after this occurred, and they said yes, they paid the students $15 an hour to go through the biology textbooks and rip those stickers out, because that sticker was too religious. I'm going to repeat it. This book contains information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about how organisms came to be. It should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. That's verbatim, almost. I might have missed an and or a the, but that's the sticker. Did you hear anything about God in that sticker, or Jesus, or the Bible, or religion in any shape, form, or fashion? No, all you heard and all it said was that what's being taught as science should be looked at with an open mind and carefully considered and studied critically. And that wasn't allowed. And I'm going to tell you this evening why I would suggest that's not allowed, because we've been told that the idea of creation is not scientific, that the idea of creation is religious, that any time you say a supernatural creator did something, because you cannot do a scientific experiment on that supernatural creator, then a large group of our society says, since you can't touch, see, taste, hear, or smell God with your 5 senses, then it doesn't count as science. And so you can have any answer you want except that one. And that's not a scientific answer, we are told. Do you know nothing could be further from the truth? For 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is that science has always been the thirst for or the discovery of knowledge in any shape, form, or fashion that it comes. You don't define out of the discipline of science something that could be a possible legitimate reality. You can't say, we're going to find the answer as long as the answer is not 2. Think about if someone did that. We're going to have math class, and in math class, we're going to let you do anything you want in math class except use the number 2. 1 plus 1, what's that equal? Don't know. Well, 3.5. Well, you can't even use a half because you got a 2.5 there, don't you? If you're using fractions anyway. You see what happens when you define something out of the discussion? Well, you're not calling into the question the thing that you defined out of discussion. You're calling into question the legitimacy of the way you go about finding answers. You see, real science has never been, hey, we're going to find any answer as long as it's not this one. Real science has always been, we're going to find the correct answer. But in modern scientific circles, they've defined God out of the discussion to their shame and to our challenge to bring God back into the scientific discussion. Now, the next aspect of why that is ridiculous to say that God is not scientific because you can't touch, see, taste, or smell Him is because we often use indirect observation to come to legitimate answers even though you can't touch, see, taste, hear, or smell the thing that you're discussing. If you've watched any forensic science, TV shows or movies, you know exactly how that works. You look at what you can see and you project it to something that you can't see. I mean, for instance, if we're walking down the beach and we look down and on the beach we see a series of footprints. And that series of footprints has 2 feet, a right and a left, and they are spread about 20 inches apart, going in a particular direction, and we look down the beach and we don't see anyone. All we see are footprints. Would any person you know say, guess these weren't made by a human because we can't see the human. We can't touch, see, taste, hear, or smell the human. All we've got are footprints here, but there's no human, so let's look around for what we can touch, see, taste, hear, or smell and say it made the footprint. And then you find a crab and you try to fit that crab's feet into the footprints, and then you find a dog that might be running stray on the beach and you try to fit that dog into the footprints. You never do that. Are there things you can know about who made the footprints without ever seeing the person? Well, let's count the toes in the footprints. It's got a right foot, it's got an arch, it's got a heel, it's got a ball right there in the front of it, and it's got 5 toe prints. How many toes did the person who put these footprints down on the beach have? 5. How do you know? You didn't see the person. You've never touched the person. You didn't even hear them walking on the beach, but you can still know how many toes they had because of the footprint. Now, if you had good enough instruments, if your instruments happened to be very sensitive and you knew the density of the sand at the time the footprint was made, and you knew how deep the footprint was, you knew the density of the sand and how deep the footprint was, what could you probably tell about the person, at least in estimation? About how much they weighed? You could. And then if you measured the distance between the footprints, you could probably, if you compared that to various people's height, and if you had somebody who was 5'6" and they had a footprint that was this far apart, and somebody who was 5'8" that had a footprint this far apart, and someone who was 5'10" that had on down the line, you could tell approximately how tall the person was, how much they weighed, how many toes they had, what their arch on their foot looked like. But you never saw the arch on their foot. You never saw what they weighed. You couldn't tell how tall they were just by looking at them. Could you? No, you couldn't. But by looking at the things that they left, you could. Now, incidentally, scientific researchers do that kind of thing all the time. That's the entire forensic science discipline is involved in looking at stuff that someone left and finding out things about who left it and what attributes and characteristics they had. Now, incidentally, it's also almost a page right out of Romans chapter 1, where the Bible says, "For since the beginning of creation, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even His eternal power and Godhead." Now, notice what the text says there. From the beginning of creation, God's invisible attributes. Have you ever looked at God? No, you haven't. But are there things about God that you can know? You didn't look at the person walking down the beach, but are there things about the person walking down the beach that you can know? Absolutely. You've never seen God, but are there things about the supernatural creator that you can know? From a scientific research point of view. Absolutely, positively. In fact, last week we looked at several of those based primarily on the idea of the law of cause and effect. And that law of cause and effect said that for every material effect you have in the universe, there is a cause that came before it, and that was greater than it. And we looked at how the modern atheistic idea that the universe popped into existence from nothing, and then it was originally a tiny singularity, 10 to the negative 26 centimeters across, and somehow exploded. We saw that that just doesn't vibe with the scientific law of cause and effect. But now we're going to look at some other things about the universe that we see and know that we can go from that to looking at how that shows us something about God. And the first thing that we're going to look at, well, it's something that everybody understands. In fact, even the smallest child that's old enough to have any type of discussion, if you walk into a child's room and there in the middle of the floor is an exact replica of, well, let's say they are Star Wars fans, rather, and there's the Millennium Falcon in Lego form in the middle of their room. Now, let's say it's your kid or grandkid, and your kid or grandkid is 5 years old, and you know that they're still using the big fat Lego blocks, and they certainly didn't put this replica together, and you go to your child and you say, "Buddy, what is this?" And he says, "Oh, it's a replica of the Millennium Falcon." You say, "Well, I know it's a replica of the Millennium Falcon, but how'd it get here?" And he said, "Mom, you will never believe this. Let me tell you what I did. I had all my Legos. And you remember you told me I need to clean up my room? Well, I just shoved them all into the middle of the floor, and I had some old firecrackers from July 4th a little while back, and I stuck one of those ladyfinger firecrackers underneath that pile, and I lit it. An exact replica of the Millennium Falcon popped out. And that's where that came from." Why do you think that's funny? I mean, it doesn't even have wires on it. It doesn't even really fly. All it is a replica Lego form of the Millennium Falcon. Well, here's what we know. You don't get something that's designed from big explosions. That doesn't happen. You need two explosions. And so your kid says, "Well, no, actually, I didn't blow it up once. I blew it up once and half of it came into existence, so I blew it up again and the other." Well, no, it's not like you need more explosions. It's not like enough explosions would ever, well, it just wasn't big enough. Your kid actually says, "No, it wasn't a ladyfinger firework. It was actually a half a stick of dynamite, and I almost blew a crater in my..." Well, it's not that it needs to be a bigger explosion. If you have more explosions and bigger explosions on a pile of Legos, what happens? You don't get any closer to the Millennium Falcon. You get a bigger mess. And so here's something that everyone understands about the real world. When you don't have intelligence involved and there is a large explosion, what happens? A bigger mess. And yet, well, the problem with the atheistic proposition, I say the problem, there are several problems with it. And I'm not ashamed to say that the Bible says the fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." And I suggest that, not attacking anyone's character necessarily, but the proposition of atheism is foolishness. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't coincide at all with anything we know to be reality. It violates every scientific law that we have basically at every turn. And one of the main ones of that is just simply the idea of design. When you have something that blows up, it never comes out working in any functional way better. And yet when you look at our universe, you know, I talked to you last week about Stephen Hawking, the theoretical physicist who said, you know, in violation of the law of cause and effect, he says stars don't pop into existence from nothing, black holes don't pop into existence from nothing, but whole universes do. Well, and his next problem was, but not whole universes that look like ours, because ours is perfect. In fact, so perfect, they say, that the constants, the laws that govern our universe are balanced on a razor's edge. So that if you changed any of them to the tiniest, slightest degree, that life in our universe could not possibly exist. You know, there are four forces in the universe at the present: the strong atomic force, the weak atomic force. You have the force of gravity, and as you look at the strong atomic force and weak atomic force, the electromagnetic force and the force of gravity, they are so closely intertwined that if you adjusted one of them by this fraction, I'm going to give you the fraction in decimal form. If you have, I'm going to work with you right here. If you have 0.1, that's 1/10 of something, right? 0.01 is 1/100. 0.001 is 1/1000. So that means if you had a piece of pie, a whole pie, and you cut it up into 1,000 pieces, 0.001 would be one tiny slice of that pie. If you adjusted the gravitational force by 0.000000000, I won't bore you with listing all of those, but out to the 40th zero, and then put a 1. If you adjusted it by that tiny of a fraction, life in our universe could not exist. So the atheistic proposition is stuck with this: we have a universe that popped into existence from nothing and then exploded into a universe that looks like it's perfectly designed for humans to live in. And when I say perfectly designed, what I mean is perfectly designed. Not, hey, it's real close to perfectly designed. It's 0.000 out to the 40th zero perfectly designed. And that's just one of hundreds of constants that if you adjusted it by a tiny, tiny fraction to such a degree that they say, hey, looks like we live in a Goldilocks zone. It's the Goldilocks principle. You remember Goldilocks, don't you? Oh yeah, the three bears, three bears were sitting down to their porridge. That was always the first problem in the three bear story to me. The porridge. I never ate porridge, but in any book that I ever read that looked like a fairy tale, the porridge just did not look like it would be something that... my mother, she cooked oatmeal. Now, we didn't have the little single packs of oatmeal like they do now. It's pre-sweetened. It's got the little bits of dried fruit in it now. You just rip it up and you can put it in the microwave, and a minute and a half later, you've got a bowl of it. That's not how my mom did it. My mom, she cooked oatmeal in a pan. And when she went to scoop us out oatmeal, it came out cylindric like the pan in that shape. It made that big... that sound, and it didn't even come in spoon form. You know what I'm talking about? Some of you have been there. I know you have. And she'd sling it into our bowl, and of course we'd put as much milk and butter and sugar as she would let us put before she said that's enough, to try to act like we weren't really eating oatmeal. Because my thought was, if you could take the leftovers out and feed it to our horse out back, then something's wrong with me eating the same thing that the horse is eating this morning. We're both having the same breakfast. I digress, obviously. Okay, they were eating porridge, which is the closest thing to oatmeal that I know. And yes, I would, under certain circumstances and conditions, love to have a bowl of oatmeal if there was no bacon left on the table. But oatmeal, porridge, whatever they were, it was just too hot, and they were going to give it some time to cool. And so they left, and Goldilocks came in, and she sat down at Daddy Bear's bowl, and it was too hot. Mama Bear's bowl too cold. Baby Bear's bowl, remember? Just right. And then she went to the living room chairs, and she sat in the chairs. Daddy Bear's chair too hard, Mama Bear's chair too soft, Baby Bear's chair just right. And she went up to the beds because she was so tired after eating all that porridge. And Daddy Bear's bed too hard, Mama bear's bed too soft. Baby bear's bed just right. Isn't it interesting that the brightest minds in the world have labeled what our universe and planet look like as the Goldilocks zone and principle, because for some reason, what one of the individuals says, it looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics so that humans can live on planet Earth. Now, he said, we're certainly not saying that there's a God, but a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics so that the magnetic field around the Earth is perfect to protect us from radiation and stuff that shoots into space. The atmosphere is perfect, and it's made up of the perfect degree and ratio of gases, so that oxygen is about 21%, nitrogen about 79%, about 1% of everything else. And if the oxygen was much higher, you probably know that oxygen is very flammable, and there would be a good chance that spontaneous flames would catch around the surface of the earth on a regular basis. But if it was much lower, then the idea of animals and humans having enough oxygen in their blood would be difficult. Everything seems like it's just right. Well, the atheistic solution that Stephen Hawking put forth was, okay, number one, yeah, you're right. Hey, you need to start the universe somewhere, but we don't have a place where we're going to say it came from nothing. Number two, yeah, you're right. It looks like this universe is the only perfect way to be made for humans to live. So how are you going to solve that problem? Well, so he says there must be an infinite number of universes, and ours must just be one in the infinite number, and it's the one that happens to look exactly right. You got any evidence for any other universe? You know what the word universe means? One. So they've had to say multiverses, and they say, well, there must be an infinite number of multiverses, and we happen to live in the one that's perfect for humans. You can't explain one universe from the atheistic proposition, much less an infinite number of them. And here's what they're up against. They're up against Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4. For every house is built by someone. But he who built all things is God. You see, the problem is we know better. When you see something that looks designed, it is designed. And we're living in a universe that, by all accounts, from the atheistic scientists who study it on the most micro level to the 3-year-old who sees it on the most macro level, we understand that things look like there is a designer behind what is going on in our universe. And when you see design, well, what's always behind design? A designer. And as you start looking at that, one of the things that is the most obviously designed in the universe is simply life of any sort. You know, we have just in the past decade or so, several decades rather, have really gotten an idea about what DNA is and how it's the coded language that is in every cell that builds various different kinds of life. You know, when Darwin put out his book on the origin of species by natural selection in 1859, Darwin thought, and people said for years, that the cell was very simple. Kind of like a protoplasmic just ball of goo, really. And that he said, you know, here's what probably happened in a warm chemical soup somewhere. He published this later. He said in a warm chemical soup somewhere, something like lightning probably struck it and brought life into existence. That idea is called spontaneous generation, and it was around for many years. Look at in the 1600s and 1700s, people thought it was true. People thought life popped into existence from non-living chemicals on a fairly regular basis. In fact, they said, we can prove that to you. Take a T-bone steak, put it on the kitchen counter in the middle of the summer, and leave your window open. You know what happens? Life spontaneously generates on that T-bone steak in the form of maggots. Did you see any maggots crawl onto the steak? You did not. Did you see any maggots fall out of the sky onto the steak? You did not, and yet somehow there are little white worms crawling all over your steak. How do you think they got there? Well, in the 1400s, 1500s, early 1600s, people thought literally that maggots popped into existence from the chemical properties of the air and the steak. And if you pick up any biology textbook and you look at it with an open mind and you study it carefully and critically consider it, you will hear the story of Francisco Redi. Some people pronounce his name Redi, R-E-D-I. And he did an experiment that every single person who's ever studied any biology, I think they generally introduce in about the 6th grade, has learned in some shape, form, or fashion. Here was the experiment. It was not difficult to understand at all. He put some meat in jars, several of them on this side of the room, put some meat in jars, several of them on this side of the room, and covered this meat, hermetically sealed it airtight with something like what we would use to cover food in the refrigerator. Now it's press and seal, but before that it was saran wrap. And if you've ever tried to get saran wrap off and get it on a clean, rip, you got some type of advanced degree that I've never been able to get, because every time I do it, I jaggedly rip it and it comes off in a ball and I try to repeel it. It's about 3 times before I can actually get it. Press and seal's a little better. It's a little thicker. Covered it, hermetically sealed it, airtight so that nothing could get in it. Flies landed on the uncovered meat. Flies landed on the sealed lids but couldn't get to the meat. Maggots formed on the uncovered meat. Maggots did not form on the meat that was sealed. Francisco Redi in 1660 or so said, there you go, I think that flies are producing maggots. They're not spontaneously generated. People said, no, you didn't do that experiment correctly because you didn't let air get into the meat, and that's part of the chemical process that spontaneously generates life. You have to let air get in there. Okay. He further extended the experiment, sealed meat, unsealed meat. In the middle, he put some meat in jars that had netting, like medical gauze type on it. Flies landed on the sealed meat, nothing. Flies landed on the unsealed meat, maggots. Flies landed on the gauze substance, maggots on the gauze, but not on the meat. He said, there you go, I think flies are producing maggots. 1660s. This was groundbreaking stuff, because spontaneous generation had been believed for several centuries. And they said, well, looks like maggots don't spontaneously generate. Redi, do you believe spontaneous generation doesn't occur? And if I understand it right, he said, no, I think it does. I just don't think maggots spontaneously generate. You see, they had other ideas, like if you wrap some old sweaty rags in wheat and stick it in the corner of your barn for 2 months and come back, guess what it spontaneously generates? Well, now just stick an old car with some rubber-cased wiring in your field and come back and look under the hood of that, or what does it spontaneously generate? Rats? Mice? That's what they said was spontaneously generated from old sweaty rags and wheat wrapped up and put in the corner of your barn. The gases and the chemical properties produce mice. And they said take a piece of wood that still has the bark on it, dump it in a wet ditch, come back in about 3 months, pop the bark off and see what you got underneath that bark. It spontaneously generates there. They believed in spontaneous generation for another 200 years at least, until a man by the name of Louis Pasteur came along. Now, if you drank any milk or juice, especially milk, you open your refrigerator and you look on the side of that milk and it says pasteurized. Well, you know what that means. It means the cows that produced that milk lived in a pasture. No, okay, obviously that's not what it means. It's not even spelled like that. Pasteurized. Louis Pasteur, a scientist who once and for all dealt the death blow to the idea of spontaneous generation. You see, in the 1860s, they had microscopes. And you didn't have to see the little stuff crawling around on top of your steak to realize that stuff was growing somewhere. In fact, take a bowl of chicken noodle soup and leave it on your counter for 3 or 4 days, and you might not be able to see it with your unaided eye, but you know something's not right, especially if you eat it. Well, what is it that's not right? Well, something. So you zoom in with a microscope. The day after it's cooked, you don't see much. No, the day of it being cooked, you don't see much. But you leave it on your counter without refrigerating it, And the day after, you see a bunch of stuff swimming around with a microscope. And the day after that, you see a bunch more. And the day after that, a whole lot more. And it finally starts making something that floats on the top. And, well, what's going on there? Well, you see a bunch of microscopic organisms that are forming in the soup. Well, the people that believed in spontaneous generation said, there you go. Microscopic organisms are growing in the soup. Where did they come from? Spontaneous generation. Pasteur said, no, they didn't. They're coming from the air. Let's prove that. And so between 1861, I think, and about 1866, he did a series of experiments. It wasn't like it was just one. In fact, as I understand it, some of these he held for a year. He would put meat broth in a special flask that had an S-shaped curve. And that S-shaped curve was designed to let air in because your spontaneous generation people said you got to have air. But it was also designed to catch all the microscopic organisms at the bottom of the S shape. So the air goes back in after he boils the meat broth or hay broth. He zooms the microscope in. He sees no microscopic organisms. He waits a day, nothing. Waits a month, nothing. Some of them, if I understand, he waits a year, nothing. Then he breaks the neck off. So the air goes straight back into the flask, and right when the air goes straight back into it, and there's not that catch anymore, microscopic organisms form. Pasteur, once and for all, dealt the death blow to the idea of spontaneous generation in about 1865. You know what's interesting to me about that is if you're reading a book that talks about evolution, they will tell you about Reedy and Pasteur. And they will say, they showed once and for all that life in this material universe cannot come from non-living chemicals. And if you're a creationist at first, you're pretty excited. It's very straightforward. Okay, good. The next paragraph, they will say, but in the past it must have, because now we have life. Okay, so here's what they've proved. In nature, life does not come from non-living chemicals. But the answer that makes sense as to how it got here has been defined out of science. There's got to be something more than nature, something supernature, something intelligent behind it. But they can't say that, and so they say, hey, life doesn't come from non-living chemicals now in nature, but it must have in the past because we have life. Well, hold on just a second. No. Where would you get life in the material universe if it can't come from non-living chemicals? You know what I find so interesting is you can take a frog that has been dead for 1 second. 1 second. It's got all of the cells and all of the chemicals and all the amino acids and proteins and everything you need for life. They can't get a protein by accident. Now you have a dead frog that's been dead for a second. It's got everything you need to live. Just make it. Make it live. Well, we don't even have a process that you can take a frog that has all of the right proteins and amino acids and chemicals and cells all intact at the present and make it live. You see, when Paul stood on Mars Hill and he talked to those Athenians who were the most educated people in the world at the time, they were the PhD crowd. And he said, that altar to the unknown God that you worship, God does not need worship. And He is not created like the gods that you are worshiping. And He gives to all life and breath and all things. You see, the most amazing design that you see in the universe happens to be the simple cell. And the idea that you could somehow get a living organism from an explosion defies everything we know about the concept of design. Now, you don't have to stop at the cellular level or that idea of just even life. If you were to look at stuff that's designed, in 1976, it was the year I was born, Thomas B. Warren was debating a man by the name of Antony Flew. And Dr. Flew was standing up to the world as the recognized leader in the atheistic community. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. He had written a paper that he presented to the Socratic Society that C.S. Lewis chaired, and that paper was the most widely read, distributed, and written on atheistic philosophical paper in the world from the mid-60s to 2020, if I understand it correctly. At least to 2006, I know for sure. The most widely distributed atheistic paper in the world. He is standing before the world as the world's leading atheist. Not the country's leading atheist. He was from England. He had a PhD from the University of Reading. He is the world's leading atheist. Thomas B. Warren, member of the Lord's Church, had a PhD from philosophy from Vanderbilt University. He is defending the proposition, the God of the Bible exists. Anthony Flew, defending the proposition, I know that the God of the Bible does not exist. They get to this argument about design. Anthony Flew is on the receiving end of this argument. It's Dr. Warren's time to present positive evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible. And Dr. Warren puts up a hand drawing, a little pencil drawing of a prosthetic limb, an artificial hand. Now, you have seen some artificial hands, I'm sure. They've come a long way in the last several decades. In fact, several years ago now actually, but there was an arm, not just a hand, an entire arm, that was artificial. A man by the name of Dr. Kukin and a team of researchers had built this 10-pound metal alloy arm that had motors in it, and a young 26-year-old Marine had lost her arm in an accident, and they connected this artificial limb to her shoulder. Now, what was interesting about this particular limb, as I read about it, was that it had motors in it that they attached to her nerves in her shoulder. So that when she thought about moving her pinky, well, if I understand it right, they didn't hook it up exactly correctly. So when she thought about moving her pinky, initially she would move one of her wrong digits, and so she had to recalibrate to move her pinky and her thumb, and she had to get used to the nerves that were hooked up to the particular motors. But what was interesting about that was that Dr. Kukin said, we've never seen anything like this in prosthetics. Now remember, this is probably 2006, 2010 or so. Dr. Flew and Dr. Warren are debating in 1976. They met for 4 nights, 2 hours every single night. Dr. Flew wrote a book later, and he said that's the most people he had ever spoken to in a live audience at one time, 5,000 people every single night. This little line drawing of a prosthetic limb, one of the 1976 models, not this new one. And they asked Dr. Kukin, how's this research going? He says, it's amazing. We're doing stuff with prosthesis, with artificial limbs. We've never seen anything like it. He said, this Marine, she can hold a spaghetti jar with one hand and with the other hand take a spoon and scoop out the remaining spaghetti sauce. We've never seen anybody be able to do that. He said, she can fold a pair of pants without using a hard surface. Wow, it's remarkable. But Dr. Flew, did this artificial hand have a designer? If you're the world's leading atheist and someone says, does this prosthetic limb have an intelligent designer, what do you have to say if you want to remain the world's leading atheist? You have to. You have to say, yes, it had a designer. It's a prosthetic limb. You can't say it popped into existence from nothing. You can't say that the natural processes in the laboratory when you flick out the lights caused it. You've got to say it had a designer. There's only one answer there. Dr. Warren put up a picture of a human hand. And he said, Dr. Flew, did this hand have a designer? Now, if you're the world's leading atheist, and you see a picture of a hand that is superior in every single way to the one you just said had a designer, but you want to stay the world's leading atheistic spokesman, what do you have to say? Sadly, if you define an intelligent designer out of the picture, Dr. Kukin, who was involved in the research for that 10-pound, $4 million arm, he said it's the best thing we've ever seen in prosthetics, but it's still clumsy. Really? $4 million arm is clumsy compared to what? I mean, not compared to the 1976 model of it. Not compared to the 1988 model of it. What's it still clumsy compared to? Your hand. Even your left hand, if you're like me. See, you accidentally cut your regular old human hand, and within split seconds, there's a chemical cascade that I think is about 27 steps that starts sending a blood clot directly to where you cut it, but nowhere else. You take a hammer and you accidentally break your finger, your body opens up a chemical cascade of enzymes that eat bone. Is that a scary thought to you? What if that got out of whack and haywire one morning? You wake up, the enzyme for bone eating has gone crazy, your whole right arm is floppy. Just so happens you've got an enzyme that eats the right bones that are broken, that aren't going to be usable anymore, but your body knows how to distinguish which chips will be usable and which chips won't. And your body then puts the pieces that are usable back together and remolds and grows that bone. And within 6 weeks, sometimes that place where you hit your finger with a hammer is stronger than it would have been if you hadn't hit it. Now, sometimes it's crooked compared to what it was before, but it still works really well. Take a hammer and smash the thumb of a $4 million metal alloy arm and see what happens in 6 weeks. What happens? Nothing. If an intelligent person doesn't come and put it back together. Dr. Flew, did this human hand have a designer? No, he said. Where did it come from? It just grew there. That's convenient, isn't it? The prosthetic limb that is clumsier in every single category somehow had an intelligent designer, but the human hand that is superior in every way just grew there? Until 2006, that's what he maintained. In 2006, he wrote a book titled, There Is No God. The no was marked out, so that the actual title said, There is a God. How the world's most notorious atheist became a believer. And in 2006, Anthony Flew, who still to this date, as I understand it, has the most published and written on atheistic philosophical paper in the world. In 2006, he came out and said, I have looked at the design in the universe, and especially in living organisms, it is absolutely impossible for the DNA that composes living organisms to be the product of blind, chance, random processes from an explosion. He said it testifies to the fact that there is an eternal, all-powerful, supernatural, intelligent designer. Folks, I'm here to maintain that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the most scientific statement any person could ever utter. It's been a pleasure being with you this evening. I appreciate your eldership for the invite. I appreciate all of you who have come out in person and all of you who are watching via the internet for being with us. Thank you very much. Look forward to our final lesson next week, and that will be, Is the Bible from God? How can we know that? And that's what we'll be dealing with next week. Let's pray. The universe
declares your majesty. You are holy.